Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Again, welcome to this week's office hours for ESG and ESG-CV. My name is Helena Emanalo, and I am today's moderator. If you are just joining us, please go to the chat and introduce yourself with your name and region you represent. As a reminder, this office hour session is being recorded for public record. A copy of the slide deck and recording will be emailed to all attendees. Next slide, please. The question format for today's series, all questions must be submitted in the chat box. Please type your question into the chat box. The team will read questions out loud at the end of the presentation and provide answers, if possible, throughout the presentation. All questions and answers entered into the chat box will be recorded as part of the public record. And alongside our presenters, we also have several HCD staff, including ESG representatives, ESG-CV grant administrators, and other consultants who are able to answer questions during the Q&A session. Next slide, please. So for today's agenda, we have ESG and ESG-CV updates, office hours updates, ESG and ESG-CV Q&A, and our spotlight session, which will be on fair market rent and rent reasonableness. And now I'll hand it over to Connie for ESG updates.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. 2022 NOFA applications, they will be released soon. It will not be this week. So I'm hoping that it will be around June 1st. But we will certainly keep you apprised of the progress and so forth. But it will be within the next couple of weeks that we will release our 2022 NOFA applications. We do have scheduled and available to register for our webinars for both NOFAs, the COC and the balance of state. Those are through Eventbrite. You should see those here pretty soon on our ESG webpage that you could go right to and register. However, I just want to let you know that that is open. We've made that live. So if you want to now, as far as we know, we're on track to hold our balance of state and COC webinars on June 7th. 2021 ESG applications. We have several of those at our routing, and that hopefully you'll see some contracts come through. Everything is through eCivis. So folks that have 2021 ESG awards, where you submitted your application through eCivis, everything is in and out of eCivis. So when it comes time for that standard agreement, there you won't be emailed to you. It'll be coming through the eCivis and you would be notified. If you have any questions, please let us know. We're hoping to get all of the 59 ESG 2021 ESG contracts executed by the end of July. 2020 ESG annual contracts, you're going to see this slide up through July 7th. Please, I know everybody's working hard. It's been kind of a struggle. Please try hard to spend your 2020 ESG annual contract. We'd be happy to meet with you, but time is ticking away and we're getting closer to that expenditure deadline. Next slide, please. Just wanted to also, we've been talking about personal identifying information, or PII. I want to just make sure everybody's hearing this and seeing this, because your reps will be requiring that you no longer send them any kind of personal identifying information for clients on those detailed expense reports. You must provide rather their HMIS number or another unique identifier for a client. Don't give us their name. Also, we now have a secure SharePoint site. All of those that have current contracts, 2020 contracts, you should have been notified and received an email from our IT department with a link to your very own private folder where you can drop in your RFS, your detailed expense reports, any kind of backup we may ask for monitoring. That also is in that secure site. If you have not been contacted, sometimes those emails go to spam. Please reach out to your ESG grant rep and we will help you get through that. We'll connect you with our IT department. Again, be sure if we do request any kind of backup documentation, whether it's leases or any security deposits, anything that could have a client's name, be sure that you redact all of that, even when that's going into that secure site. I wanted to mention that we now have several policy documents for the ESG program. They are being posted to the ESG webpage. Right now, if you go to the ESG webpage under our resources tab, you will find our homelessness prevention manual. So those that have homelessness prevention funds in their contract, you must have policies and procedures and in your written standards saying how you run your homelessness prevention program. This manual will help you. So again, if you're not sure where to find it, reach out to your grant rep. We also have our policy on personal identifying information that is also on our ESG webpage under the resources tab. And there is more to come. Our head consultants, ICF, are helping us write these policies, and we are really excited to be able to have these and to share them with you. Next slide, please. Again, this is your ESG, your annual ESG team. And please reach out to us if you're not sure who to contact. You can always reach us at that esgnofa@hcd.ca.gov. And I'll turn it back over to you, Helena.
Thank you, Connie. So for ESG-CV updates, in order to meet HUD's 50% expenditure deadline in June, please submit an RFF to your grant administrator via email by June 2nd. Please include as many expenses as possible. And as Connie already mentioned, you must redact all client personal identifying information in your backup documentation. So social security number, full name, address, all of that. Any RFF submissions with client PII will be returned for changes. Next slide, please. So for upcoming office hour topics, we have the diversity and COC leadership on June 1st, authentic engagement of persons with lived experience on June 8th, and we have housing problem solving on June 15th. And the training site link is above on this slide. So you will be receiving these slides and have access to those links. Next slide, please. COVID response resources. Here you can find the infection control measures and CDC and NHCHC guidance. Next slide, please. And for ESG resources and TA links, everything you need is on this slide here. Any questions? All right, if we have no questions, I will hand it over to Chris.
Thanks, Helena. And thank you all for joining us today. Next slide, please. Oh, one more. There we go. Thank you. So thanks for being with us today. Today's Spotlight series, we're going to talk about fair market rent and rent reasonableness. We know that many of you are out there doing rapid rehousing that might need a refresher on how best to assure that the rents that we are using in our communities meet fair market rent or the rent reasonableness standards. So today from the ICF team, we are joined by Gordon Levine and Michael Thomas. I'm going to hand it to Mike first to get us started. Mike.
Thanks, Chris. Good morning, everyone. As Chris just said, I'm Michael Thomas. I use he, him pronouns, and I am a technical assistance provider with ICF. So I'm going to jump right in because we have a lot of material to cover. Next slide, please. So first, we're going to talk about the foundations of fair market rent and rent reasonableness. So just some general ideas underlying those two things. Next slide, please. First order of business is going to be a question for the group. So this is just to test your knowledge, what you already know. So you should see a poll popping up. We are going to move through these pretty quickly because we want to have time for discussion at the end. But you'll see here, the question is, which of the following is true of fair market rent and rent reasonableness? And you can see your options there on the screen. And just go ahead and pick which one of those you think is correct. Which one do you think is true about fair market rent and rent reasonableness? And we're going to give you probably about 10 or 15 more seconds to put in an answer for that.
Just a friendly note, we can't see who is answering what. This is just, we see how many people answered what. So all of this is anonymous.
Yes, very good note. Do not be afraid to answer with what you think it is, because we have no idea who you are in these answers. Okay. All right, so it looks like we had a slight majority there saying option C is true. So we can go ahead and close that and pop the answer up on the screen. Let's see which one was correct. There we go. So the correct answer is that fair market rent and rent reasonableness are primarily designed to ensure unit affordability. So option D there, which was slightly below in the answers in terms of percentage that answered, but good job to those who picked that one. So let's learn more about that on the next slides. So some highlights. Fair market rent and rent reasonableness are housing affordability standards for ESG rapid rehousing and prevention, and other HUD programs too, especially FMR. Fair market rent and rent reasonableness apply differently to annual ESG and ESG-CV. So if you have one or the other of those types of funding, or if you have both, please pay attention. There are differences. We will have more information on that coming up. Subrecipients must determine whether a unit meets applicable fair market rent and/or rent reasonableness standards before the initial lease is signed, and periodically thereafter. We'll talk a little more about recertification as we go through this as well. Next slide, please. So fair market rent. Fair market rent values are set annually by HUD. They are released in October every year. Every county and metropolitan service area, or MSA, has its own fair market rent. Fair market rent assessments are pretty straightforward. The gross rent, we'll talk about what that means later, cannot exceed fair market rent for annual ESG appropriated for federal fiscal year 2021 and forward. Gross rent may exceed FMR for annual ESG appropriated for fiscal year 2020 and earlier, and for ESG-CV. So what we're really saying there is the fair market rent standard does not apply for ESG annual funds that were appropriated for fiscal year 2020 or earlier because of because of COVID-19 waivers. And then the ESG-CV notice also makes it such that fair market rent does not apply to those funds. Next slide, please. Rent reasonableness is a little different. ESG recipients and subrecipients, and this includes sub-subrecipients, must establish standards for rent reasonableness. Subrecipients determine whether units meet rent reasonableness. It is calculated using local, comparable, unsubsidized units. It is not a fixed value, and it will differ between units. So it's a more flexible standard. It is more complex than fair market rent, but there are ways to simplify it for the recipient and subrecipient staff. So it is a complicated thing, but there are ways that you can make it easier. Gross rent cannot exceed rent reasonableness as established by the written policy, and that goes for all ESG-CV funding. So annual ESG of any year and ESG-CV, all units must meet the rent reasonableness standard. Next slide, please. And I'm going to turn it over to Gordon.
All right, thank you, Mike. For those of you who haven't met me, my name is Gordon Levine. My pronouns are he, him. I've been with ICF for a few months now, and I come to you most recently from the Louisiana Balance of State COC, where I was the manager there, and the state of Wisconsin, where I was their ESG and the rest of their HUD acronym soup manager. So excited to be with you all. Next slide, please. All right, so let's test your knowledge. So you're going to get another poll here. Remember that your answers are anonymous. This is just to get a feeling of where y'all are. True or false, every household that receives any kind of assistance through ESG or through ESG-CV is subject to the applicable fair market rent and rent reasonableness standards. Is that true or is that false? We're going to be about 15 seconds with that one. Wish we had some Jeopardy music here. All right, well, let's have a look at it, Aaron. Well, the poll's gone. I couldn't see the answers. There we go. Let's see. 2/3 of you said true, 1/3 of you said false, and the 1/3 of you that said false had it. It is false. Let's go to the next slide and see how that works out. So requirements for rapid rehousing in HP, and it is a bit of a trick question. So we're going to get into why that was a little bit of a trick. Rental arrears payments are separate from rental assistance. When a subrecipient, which means a recipient of ESG from HCD, provides a one-time rental arrears payments without rental assistance, fair market rent and rent reasonableness assessments are not required. I'm going to say that again. A one-time rental arrears payment is separate from rental assistance and does not require FMR and RR calculations. So what is required is it is required for providing rental assistance, or they are required for providing rental assistance, and a one-time arrears payment, for providing rental assistance and housing relocation or stabilization assistance, but it is not required for providing a one-time arrears payment, for providing just housing relocation or stabilization services. But if you then later begin providing rental assistance, it becomes required at that time. Next slide, please. So certification and recertification timing. The initial certification for rent reasonableness and fair market rent occurs before the initial lease is executed. So it has to happen before everybody signs on the dotted line. For recertification, it has to occur at all of these points, though one of them is the normal time that it happens. It has to occur before any lease renewal is executed. It has to occur if an existing participant moves to a new unit before the new lease is executed, whenever the project's written policy requires it, and you'll see that we've underlined that, we bolded it, and we stuck an asterisk on it to draw your attention, because it means that subrecipients need to have written policies for their fair market rent and rent reasonableness certification and recertification, because if you don't have a written policy, you can't require or specify when you don't require it. And there are certain other reassessment triggers that are in the slide notes, but that don't come up very frequently. As a very general rule, FMR and RR need to be assessed before any lease is entered into, renewed, or changed. Next slide, please. Back over to you, Mike.
Thank you. So now we are going to talk a little more about fair market rent. Next slide, please. And another poll for you. So you're going to see that pop up on your screen. True or false, utility costs are an important consideration in calculating fair market rent. And I guess the way I should have worded that, are an important consideration in calculating gross rent as it applies to the fair market rent calculation. So when you're thinking about doing the fair market rent comparison, you're calculating gross rent. Are utility costs an important consideration in that? True or false? We'll give you about 10 or 15 seconds there. All right, looks like the majority said true. So let's see what the answer is. Indeed, that is correct. The answer is true. Let's move on to the next slide and we'll see why. So the key concept here is the concept of gross rent. So when you're doing that fair market rent comparison, the number you're comparing the fair market rent to is gross rent. And that includes the contract rent. So that's the amount of rent owed by the tenant to the owner in the lease, the actual rental amount. And then occupancy fees. So that's any fees required for occupancy under the lease, excluding late fees and pet fees. Pet fees are not eligible. Late fees cannot be paid with ESG funds. But occupancy fees otherwise included in the lease go into gross rent. And then you've got the utility allowance. So the monthly utility allowance is established by the local public housing authority. It's important to note that the only utilities you're including are the ones that are not part of the lease. So take, say, water, for instance. If that is included in the lease, then it is not part of the utility allowance that is added on to calculate gross rent. And it's also important to note that when we say the local public housing authority, some areas are covered by multiple housing authorities. An agency can use whichever of those they choose, but they must do so consistently. So you can't use the utility allowance from one or the other based on a number you're trying to get to. The agency should have a policy on which housing authority they are going to use in those situations. But when you add all of this together, you get the gross rent, and that is the number that you are using. Next slide, please.
Hey, Mike, I have a question about this, the current slide.
Yes.
Under the monthly utility allowance, you mentioned some projects may be covered by more than one public housing authority and that they should have some kind of a policy for deciding how that happens. What kind of a policy should they have?
A written policy.
A written policy. I know that we're hammering on it, but it is so important to have written policies for these things.
Yes, absolutely. And that's because in monitoring, if you are using a certain housing authority, it's probably going to be asked, why do you use that housing authority? And your answer should always be, because our written policy says that's the one we use, and it should support that. So yes, written policy. And your written policy will need to be consistent with any guidance that HCD may release as well. So what you see here, assessing fair market rent. This is an example. So in this example, the contract rent, the amount that's owed for rent every month is $1,500. There's $50 worth of occupancy fees in the lease. And then the utility allowance is $237, which gives you a gross rental amount of $1,787. So that is your number that you're using to compare, to compare. In this example, the fair market rent value is the exact same, $1,787. So when that is looked up on HUD's website for that area, that is the fair market rent. Since the gross rent is equal to that, then this unit meets the FMR standard because the gross rent is equal to or less than the fair market rent value. So as you can see, that's a pretty straight comparison to do once you've calculated the gross rent. It's a simple standard. Next slide, please. And back to you, Gordon.
Thank you, Mike. Let's get into calculating rent reasonableness. Next slide, please. All right, another poll. Which of the following is not a consideration when identifying comparable units for calculating rent reasonableness? Which of these is not a consideration when identifying comparable units for calculating rent reasonableness? We'll give you 10 or 15 seconds on this one. 75% of y'all got the last one right. I was very impressed. It was very cool to see. All right, well, answers in quick. A solid majority of you thought it was C, security deposits. Let's have a look. You are absolutely correct. Security deposits are not a consideration. Let's have a little bit more information on our next slide. So key concept, what is reasonable? Gross rent for participant units must be reasonable, which means less than or equal to, that's what that little caret and the equal sign means, less than or equal to other comparable unassisted units in the area. It should also take into consideration unit location, quality, size, type, age, amenities, and maintenance and utilities provided by the owner. It may also take into consideration other factors as defined by the project in their written policies and procedures. The recipient determines what documentation is required to meet rent reasonableness standards, again, in its written policies and procedures. The recipient, again, this is HCD, the statewide HCD, may require subrecipients to use specific forms, data sources, or procedures for rent reasonableness. And if they choose to do so, it will again be in the policies and procedures that the recipient, HCD, puts out. Next slide, please. Another key concept, written rent reasonableness policies. We're hammering on these because they are so critically important. They're a critical part of how you carry out your day-to-day job, and also in how you create institutional knowledge that persists between employees who are concurrent and also who follow after each other in the same organization. Your written rent reasonableness policies should describe how comparable units are identified, list the qualities that are assessed for comparability, which have to require some of those things we just talked about and may require additional things as defined by the project. Establish the documentation standards. So what are you using to demonstrate that a certain unit does meet XYZ standard? Define what reasonable is. And this is the one that's going to bake y'all's noodles. So I'm going to take like 30 extra seconds on this one. So everybody who comes from like Section 8 world, or who is used to fair market rent, thinks rent reasonableness is another cap, right? So the end product of all rent reasonableness is a number that the rent can't go over, right? Absolutely wrong, absolutely incorrect. Rent reasonableness, or rather what is considered reasonable, is defined by the recipient, so HCD, or if HCD chooses not to define it, it's defined by the subrecipient, or the sub-subrecipient if the subrecipient doesn't make that choice. And so, assuming it's not defined for you, projects at the service provider level can define what they mean by reasonable. And so you could choose to say, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to take the 3 comparable units and we're going to say the average of their rent amounts is the rent reasonableness standard. And so our participants' units must be equal to or less than the average of 3 comparable units. Totally fine. Absolutely good with that, but it's not the only way to do it. For example, you may instead say, we're going to take the average of 3 units and participant rent needs to be within $50 either direction of that amount. And so the participant's unit could be $50 over rent reasonableness, and that could be entirely fine as long as that's in your written policies and procedures. And so rent reasonableness at base is more complicated than fair market rent, as we've said, but it's also more flexible, and it gives you more control to say locally, we need a little more flexibility around what units we're looking at and what we're using to calculate that standard. There's way more information out there about this than we've included on the slide. We've got a great link there to some HUD information about calculating rent reasonableness in FMR for ESG. Go ahead and give that a click sometime. Next slide, please. All right, so here's an example of how you might go about assessing rent reasonableness. So the organization's policy is that all units must have the same number of bedrooms and be in the same census tract, and that participant gross rent, the gross rent for their unit, must be less than or equal to the gross rent for each comparable. So the lowest comparable sets the ceiling. If you look to the left, the assessment is that all of the comparable units are 1 bedrooms. All of the units total are 1 bedrooms. All of the units are in census tract 24. Great. The participant's gross rent, which is $750, is less than or equal to the gross rent for each comparable unit, which are respectively $750, $900, and $800. And so the outcome of which is that the unit meets rent reasonableness standards. They all have the same bedrooms, they're all in the same census tract, and the participant unit's gross rent is less than or equal to the gross rent for all of the comparable units. Staff should then sign and date the form they use to do this calculation and stick it in the participant file or upload it to HMIS, depending on how you're handling that. Next slide, please. Pop quiz. Looking at what is currently on the screen, the participant unit meets other rent reasonableness comparability qualifications like bedroom size and location and everything else, using just the information on your screen about rent amounts. And knowing that the project's rent reasonableness policy compares participant rent to the average rent of all comparable units. Does this meet rent reasonableness standards? Can ESG subsidize this unit? Yes or no? I think we've got a poll for this. Am I right? Yes, perfect poll. So does this meet rent reasonableness standards? And as always, I'm not sure is an okay answer. It's especially okay when it comes to rent reasonableness. But just using the numbers up there and knowing that you're comparing the participant's unit, the average rent of comparable units, can ESG subsidize this unit? I'll give you another few seconds. The Jeopardy theme is playing in my head. I'm choosing not to like hum it for you all because that would be cruel, but it is in my head if you wondered. All right. Ooh, half of you said yes, a quarter said no, and a quarter were not sure. Good spread. Let's see what the answer is. Mike, I think I stole this slide from you. I'm sorry about that.
That is completely fine.
All right. You want to take the answer?
Sure.
All yours.
So, one of the big tip-offs from how the question was asked is that the same answer is correct, no matter what ESG funding source we're talking about here. But ESG cannot subsidize this unit because what you see is that the fair market rent that's established by HUD is $1,000. The rent reasonableness comp average is $950, and the gross participant rent is $975, which exceeds rent reasonableness. It does not exceed fair market rent, but it does exceed rent reasonableness. And the rent reasonableness standard applies to all ESG funding. And in this particular example, the rent reasonableness comparison policy was a simple equal to or less than. And so since this gross participant rent exceeds the rent reasonableness comp average, ESG can't subsidize this unit. So that is the answer. Congratulations to everyone who got that. Next slide, please. And so to wrap it up, here are some resources that you can look to for further information. There's the ESG interim rule, which I am sure everyone is intimately familiar with, right? So that's 24 CFR Part 576. The rent reasonableness and fair market rent under the ESG solutions or emergency solutions grant program. You can see the link to that there. That's also a really useful document. There is a sample rent reasonableness checklist and certification that HUD has put out as well, which just shows you kind of what the comparison can look like. So that's something that you might want to take a look at as well. And that is all that I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Gordon. Let's go to the next slide. So as you know, our Spotlight series, we like to hold time to have conversations with our presenters on the topic today. So again, fair market rent and rent reasonableness. I have a few things that I want to say before we get into that, but we can go ahead and take the slides down and have this be more conversational. So you can ask questions in the chat. I will happily read those. You can also come off mute, ask your questions verbally, or raise your hand and we'll unmute you and you can ask your questions verbally, whatever makes the most sense for you. So there were a couple things that I heard Mike and Gordon say that I just want to go back to. I think the first is having a written policy. I heard that. I could lost count, but I don't know, maybe 10 times. And that is often a place where when monitoring begins, that's the first place we falter. We're using a standard, but we haven't written it down, or we're not using a standard at all, and that's even worse. So Mike and Gordon, anything to add to that? That felt like a really big theme that we wanted to hit on.
No, I would just add that it's critically important. The written standards is the first place we go to monitor. It's the first place you go when you've got new staff. It's the first place where older staff go to look and reference. It's how you reconcile actual practice to what you're supposed to be doing. It is your first stop. It is everybody's first stop when looking at a project.
Yeah, I agree. I think the only thing I would add on top of that is just because of the fact that rent reasonableness, like we mentioned earlier, is a more flexible standard, having a written policy that defines how you implement it at your agency is critical because you have to show why you're doing what you're doing, and that's how you do it.
All right, next question is really not a question either. It's more of a statement that I want to make sure folks have. We didn't get too deep into this, but having fair market rent a check or a rent reasonableness form in the client file, very good policy. In fact, it should be there. Any thoughts on that, Gordon?
Yeah, I mean, I think yes. You do have to document that you have done these two analyses. And so there has to be something somewhere showing that you did it. So yes.
Great.
Yep. Only thing I would add is when I used to monitor ESG programs, the first thing I did was ask for the written policies and procedures. Second thing I did was ask for participant files so I could go look at the FMR and RR, because it was often a point of contention and it was often the place where things went wrong, put it like that.
Yeah,
that's why I asked those questions in that order, because those are seem to be two things that folks need to focus on. So I'm going to go to this question. I think, Gordon, this was a piece you were talking to, but I know you both can speak to it. And I lost the question. Oh, yes. So under what conditions can ESG pay rental arrears? Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? I think, Gordon, you were talking about that early on in your section, and there was a question that came up, and I wanted to make sure we circled back to it.
Yeah, I'll grab it. So it's a great question. Rental arrears is treated differently than rental assistance. They are thought about differently. And so FMR and RR only need to be calculated when rental assistance becomes part of the assistance being delivered to the participant. When you are only delivering parts of rapid rehousing that are not rental assistance, which includes rental arrears and all of the forms of case management and stabilization, fair market rent and rent reasonableness do not need to be calculated. That said, if you do introduce rental assistance later, you do at that point need to calculate FMR and RR for their unit.
Thanks, Gordon. Mike, anything to add to that? That seems pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, I think that's comprehensive. HUD's guidance has consistently been exactly what Gordon just said. So it's not necessarily intuitive, because in the regs, rental arrears fall under the rental assistance section. But again, the HUD guidance has been consistent that rental arrears are separate.
Excellent. Mike, I think I'll throw this one to you just out of trying to have some parity. Does fair market rent and rent reasonableness apply when just the first month of rent is paid as part of move-in costs?
Yes, because so let's untangle a couple of things here. So there's moving costs, which is a separate category of things that falls under a different part of the regulation. So first month's rent is not going to fall under moving costs. It's going to fall under rental assistance, which is another thing. To complicate it further, there's also last month's rent. That does not fall under rental assistance. That falls under financial assistance in the regs. So basically what I'm saying is moving costs and last month's rent fall under a different part of the regulation and are not necessarily subject to all of the things we just talked about. The first month's rent is basically paying the first month of rental assistance for the household. So that falls under the rental assistance portion. And even if that's all you're paying, it is subject to all of the requirements. So it's subject to fair market rent, rent reasonableness, rental assistance agreement, lease requirements, all of that.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Gordon. All right. We have a question from Miriam that I am going to hold on to for a second because I want to pull the slide back up with the diagram that we have so folks aren't lost. So Taylor, I know you're working on the slides. I'm going to ask one question between this, but can you get ready to pull that slide back up for me in about a minute or two? Just want to talk about the waiver that removed fair market rent from ESG-CV and annual ESG used for coronavirus. That did not waive rent reasonableness. I did not waive both standards. You still have to use that standard. So I don't remember who was talking about that. The waivers, could you talk just a little bit more about that? Make sure that folks are crystal clear on it.
Sure. So HUD released a series of waivers that could be applied to annual ESG. The guidance since those have been released is that there will be none of those waivers can be applicable to ESG appropriations for federal fiscal year 2021 or forward. So for everything that is annual ESG for federal fiscal year 2021 appropriations and forward, both fair market rent and rent reasonableness are going to apply. For annual ESG for federal fiscal year 2020, the waivers apply. ESG-CV is governed by the ESG-CV notice, which also applies waivers to waiver isn't the right way to say it. It applies a different standard for that funding stream. But the result is the same for both. You don't have to apply the fair market rent standard to ESG-CV rental assistance or to ESG annual rental assistance from federal fiscal year 2020 or before. It only excludes fair market rent. So that standard doesn't apply. Rent reasonableness still applies. So the bottom line there is it does not matter what year your annual ESG funding is from. It does not matter if it's ESG CV. Rent reasonableness is always going to apply no matter what.
Thanks, Mike. All right, Taylor, I see you got the slides up. Gordon, can you remind me which slide that last question was on that Miriam's asking questions about?
Yeah, I think Miriam is asking about the very last poll question we did, which was, can ESG subsidize this unit? Would have been like the third or fourth to last slide. It's got bubbles pointing at each other, 3 of them.
Yep, a little bit farther. One more.
There we go.
That's the one. Yep, there we go. Okay, so we confused some folks with this question, so I just want to go back to it. Do ESG and ESG-CV require that subsidized units have gross rent below the rent reasonable standard defined in the organization's written policy, or could a sub-subrecipient specify a different relationship between the rent reasonable standard and acceptable units for subsidy?
This is a great question. We absolutely confuse some people with this because it is confusing, is the reality. And we kind of blew through it, and I tried to linger, but we blew through it. But that's what this question period is for. Fair market rent is an obvious and easy standard, right? HUD says the fair market rent is $800, so the unit has to be under $800, at or under $800. Rent reasonableness requires that varying levels of the recipient, the subrecipient, and the sub-subrecipient gradually define what is considered reasonable. So the recipient, which in this case is HCD, could choose to define what the rent reasonableness standard is. If they don't, then the subrecipient can. And if they don't, then the sub-subrecipient can. And each of them can further refine that to be more restrictive, but then not less restrictive. I seem to recall that HCD's rent reasonableness policy merely requires that people set a policy rather than requiring that they do something really specific and prescriptive. So that's the way the policy sort of nesting doll approach works. But the upshot of that is that at the subrecipient or the service provider level, whichever works in your grant stream, you should, in your written policy, define what reasonable means for the purposes of determining rent calculations in relation to your comparables. And so you're empowered to define how many comparable units you pick. You could say 2, it could be 50. It's entirely up to the project. Don't use 50. Maybe 3 is a good number. But you can also define what the participant unit's gross rent should be in relation to some calculation to do with the comparable units. The most straightforward way is to say something like the participant's gross rent must be less than or equal to the average gross rent of all comparables, or below the lowest gross rent of any comparable, something like that. But you can get more complicated than that and say the participant's gross rent must be lower than the average gross rent of comparables plus $100 or plus $200. The point is that it needs to be consistently applied across your project and it needs to be defined in your written policies. But you have the flexibility to say, like, you know what, it doesn't make sense for us to be hamstringing ourselves with this low rent reasonableness. We're going to raise that ceiling by $100. And that's what that's intended to do. Hopefully that answered your question. If it didn't, please reopen it.
You got a big old thank you in the chat from Miriam, so thank you for that. And Taylor, thank you for bringing those back up. You can take the slides back down. I think our next few questions are more straightforward. I cannot remember which one of you were speaking, but we were talking about occupancy fees, and I heard a few of what aren't occupancy fees, like pet deposit and a few other things. But can you provide examples of what are acceptable occupancy fees?
Sure, I think that was the section I was doing, so I'll grab that one. So occupancy fees can be called different things in the lease. I think from what I have seen, my experience is that if it is a standard fee that is charged to all tenants and it's included in the lease and it is required to live there, then it is going to be an eligible occupancy fee. So like one example I've seen in the past is every tenant who lives in a complex is charged a $25 admin fee every month. And that's in the lease, it's spelled out, and it's charged to everyone consistently. Because they have to pay that to have that lease and to live in that unit, I would consider that to generally fall under occupancy fees because you have to pay it to live there. So again, I think they can be called different things in different leases by different landlords. But just to reiterate, if it is a standard fee charged to every tenant and it is required to be in the lease and to be paid to live in the unit, it's probably going to be an eligible occupancy fee.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate that. Another question here, and this is a longer one, so I'm going to go a little slow on it. So if a unit does not meet rent reasonableness and the provider issues a deposit, a landlord incentive, so obviously we're talking about either annual ESG for COVID relief or ESG-CV, but I see ESG-CV at the end, so we're going to go with ESG-CV. Landlord incentive and rental assistance are all items disqualified with the issuance of the rental assistance, or only the rental assistance is disallowed and the deposit / landlord incentives are allowable. This is a very tricky question. We may or may not have an answer, but I'm going to give it a try. Who would like to be? I see a hand. Gordon, go for it.
It is a tricky question, and the answer isn't the same for all three things. So first of all, you should not have issued any of those before rent reasonableness was conducted, right? It is always a good practice if you are anywhere in the neighborhood of giving money to landlords to conduct rent reasonableness in advance if you think you are drifting into rental assistance territory. So I'm just going to put that out there right now. Two of these things are absolutely rental assistance. And so if you issued rental assistance payments before doing rent reasonableness, then you have made an upstream error that needs to be corrected sort of downstream. So that's one thing. As you've highlighted, right, rental assistance can't be issued to a unit that does not meet rent reasonableness standards. Security deposit also cannot be issued to a unit that does not meet rent reasonableness standards because it is part of rental assistance. I do not know the answer to landlord incentive, because that's something that is eligible only under the relevant ESG-CV notice. It's not part of the ESG interim rule. And I do not recall whether it is grandfathered in under rental assistance or whether it's just a freestanding thing. Chris, Mike, any ideas?
I don't know. Landlord incentive.
Yeah.
I do not think it's tied to rental assistance because it actually has to be paid before any lease is entered into. So you might not even know the terms of the lease when issuing landlord incentives.
That's a really good piece of reasoning. So yeah, I'll go with that.
But I think landlord incentives are they're intended to engage landlords that you can actually use to rent to your clients. So
yes.
Though we could do it, maybe it's not the best. And I think if that question asker has more questions about specifically landlord incentives and their allowability, I would go to the HUD ask a question. And if you need that link, let us know. We'll put it in the chat to get really specific, because that's a really specific situation for which landlord incentives weren't intended. But I could think of a situation where you provide a landlord incentive to a landlord for a unit that might not meet rent reasonableness or FMR because they have a bunch of others that do, and you want to build a relationship. That seems okay, but I think it still is one of those gray areas that I would, before I went too deep down, make sure that it was 100% copacetic.
Yep. Also, I would add that we're thinking of this in terms of rapid rehousing, but HP is a whole other kettle of fish. And I, at least from a best practices standpoint, you know, if I know the unit's over, knowing the California rental market, I would rather keep somebody in a unit that's slightly over rent reasonableness with a landlord incentive if I think that's going to stick long term, even if there's no deposit or rent attached, than like, sorry, your unit's $10 over. Let's go find you a new unit.
All right. I do not see any further questions. Would anyone like to come off mute or raise their hand to talk with us directly, or shall we take an early break today? And just again, to reiterate, back to our last question asked at Eleanor, if you have more landlord incentive questions, we do want you to go to the Ask a Question because it is very tricky. Okay. I am not hearing any. So with that, I want to thank you for being with us. We'll be back at it next week, doing another spotlight. It did seem like folks liked the polls, so we might add more of those in the future because there was great response and it got folks thinking and active. So thank you very much for joining us for today's Office Hours and Spotlight series. We can't wait to see you next week. Have a great one.